Hello, and welcome back to the Easter Historian's Bedtime Stories. I'm Jason. Tonight, we're talking about a man who became king at 20, had pushed his realm from Greece all the way to India by the age of 30, and never lost a battle, yet lived for only 32 years. He was Alexander the Great, the greatest conqueror in Western history, and the last lonely king before his empire began to fall apart. Our story begins in the stifling Babylonian summer of 323 BC. In the height of summer, not a breath of wind moved through the city. The air felt as though an invisible hand had closed around its throat. Outside the palace, the borders of the empire were still expanding. Inside, the man who had conquered half the known world in just 10 years could no longer finish a sentence. His generals gathered around the bed, holding their breath as they waited for an answer. Every one of them understood that something more dangerous than any Persian army was now approaching. After Alexander died, who would inherit the thing they called an empire? The answer later generations loved most was, to the strongest. Perhaps Alexander really said it. Perhaps it was only a line invented by the victors as they fought over his inheritance. Either way, it became a key to the deepest mystery of his life. A man may conquer every land he can see, but can he conquer the chaos that follows his death? At 32, Alexander possessed a degree of power that many kings never approached, even after a lifetime on the throne. Yet almost everything he had built in 13 years began to crack the moment he closed his eyes. So the real question is not simply how he won so many wars. It is what transformed a Macedonian prince into a conqueror of the world, and what planted the seeds of destruction inside his success. Before telling Alexander's story, we have to admit a problem. We are very far away from him. Historians, secretaries, generals, and sailors did record the campaigns while he was alive, but most of those contemporary works have been lost. The surviving authors who tell his life as a continuous story, Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, Curtius, and Justin, wrote centuries after his death. Arrian drew heavily on Ptolemy and Aristobulus, both of whom had accompanied the expedition, and he was especially good at describing war. Plutarch cared more about character, choice, and moral drama. Other writers preferred palace conspiracies, drunken quarrels, and astonishing tales. The same event can look like several mirrors that refuse to line up. So in the story ahead, we will try to separate the more reliable historical thread from the more legendary traditions. Because the most fascinating thing about Alexander is not that he belongs entirely to history or entirely to myth. It is that, even while he was alive, he was already blending the two. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon. At the time, Macedon was not the center of the world later generations would imagine. To many Greek city-states in the south, the Macedonians spoke a regional form of Greek and preserved a rougher style of kingship, aristocratic feasting, and tribal custom. They were close relatives, yet were often dismissed as uncivilized northerners. Athens had its navy, theaters, and orators. Sparta had centuries of military prestige. Thebes had only recently passed through a period of great power. Macedon, by contrast, looked like a frontier kingdom stitched together from mountains, forests, and cavalry nobles, with Thracians, Illyrians, and other formidable peoples constantly threatening its borders. The first man to change all of that was not Alexander, but his father, Philip II. As a young man, Philip had lived in Thebes as a hostage, where he saw firsthand how the great southern powers trained armies, organized alliances, and used diplomacy. Once he became king, he turned Macedon into a steadier and sharper machine of war. He armed his infantry with longer pikes and formed them into deep, disciplined phalanxes. He organized the aristocratic cavalry into the companion cavalry, capable of smashing into an enemy line at the decisive moment. The phalanx moved like a slow wall covered in spikes. The cavalry struck like a blade from the flank. Supported by light troops, missile units, engineers, and siege machinery, this army could do far more than fight head-on. It could cross rivers, climb mountains, besiege cities, and pursue broken enemies. Philip also understood that marriage, bribery, intimidation, or a promise made over wine could sometimes cost less than a spear. He was both a military reformer and a patient, dangerous politician. Alexander's mother, Olympias, came from the royal house of Epirus in the west. She had a fierce personality, practiced religious rites with a mystical character, and carried an almost burning expectation of her son's destiny. On his father's side, the family claimed descent from Heracles. On his mother's side, it claimed descent from the line of Achilles, hero of the Trojan War. In other words, Alexander did not grow up hearing merely that he should become a capable king. He grew up hearing that the blood of heroes ran through him. Such dynastic myths were not unusual in ancient royal families. But for a fiercely competitive child with an extraordinary memory, growing up in an expanding kingdom, they were more than stories. They were a command repeated every day. Later generations added an even brighter glow to his birth. Some said Olympias dreamed that lightning entered her body. Others said Philip dreamed that he sealed his wife's womb with the image of a lion. Still others linked the night of Alexander's birth to the burning of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, as though an old goddess had failed to protect her sanctuary because she was busy witnessing the arrival of a new conqueror. These legends cannot be treated as fact, but they do reveal one fact. Alexander's later achievements seemed so extraordinary that ordinary birth no longer felt worthy of him. Thunder, lions, and fire had to enter the story from the beginning. His real childhood contained fewer miracles, but no less pressure. Philip was frequently away at war. Olympias worked to make her son the strongest possible claimant to the throne. The court was crowded with other wives, other children, and other noble families. Behind every smiling face, there might be a political position. Alexander learned early that a prince was not a child hidden away for protection. He was a political target visible to everyone. He had to be braver and cleverer than boys his own age. And above all, he could not afford to appear weak. According to one story, when Persian envoys came to Pella, the young Alexander did not ask only about the splendor of their palaces or the clothes worn by their king. He questioned them about distances, the size of the army, and the way the Persian king made war. The tale may have been embellished, but it fits the man he later became. His curiosity about unfamiliar worlds was joined to a desire to possess them. Another child hearing of a distant country might ask what wonders could be found there. Alexander's first thought was often how to reach it. His early tutors were strict. They trained him to eat sparingly, endure cold, ride, hunt, and recite poetry. Later, Philip invited the philosopher Aristotle to educate Alexander and a group of Macedonian noble youths in the wooded retreat at Mysa. Some of those classmates would later become Alexander's closest generals, friends, and administrators. They studied together and eventually marched into Asia together. Aristotle taught him not only ethics and politics, but medicine, nature, geography, literature, and logic. During his campaigns, Alexander would observe plants, ask about terrain, take an interest in the sources of rivers, and send unfamiliar specimens back to his teacher. But education never automatically turns a student into the person a teacher hopes to create. Aristotle valued the ordered world of the Greek city-state. Alexander would go on to rule an empire spanning many languages and traditions. A teacher could show him how to classify the world, but not decide how he would try to possess it. Of all the poems he read, Alexander loved the Iliad most. Achilles became his model. Young, swift, glorious, furious, and willing to choose a brief, brilliant life over a long, uneventful safety. Tradition says Aristotle prepared a special edition for him, and that Alexander kept it under his pillow during the campaign beside a dagger. Whether or not every detail is reliable, the image captures the structure of his imagination. Books and weapons were not two separate lives. They were two sides of the same heroic dream. Poetry showed him what greatness should look like. The army gave him the means to turn poetry into reality. The most famous story from Alexander's youth is the taming of Bucephalus. The horse was expensive, violent, and liable to throw anyone who came near it. Philip was ready to give up when Alexander noticed that the animal was not truly vicious. It was frightened by its own shadow trembling on the ground. He turned the horse toward the sun, placing the shadow behind it, soothed it gently, then suddenly mounted and galloped away. When he returned safely, Philip is said to have wept and told him, "My son, find a kingdom worthy of you." Macedon is too small. The words may not be exact, but they have survived for more than 2,000 years because they seem to summarize Alexander's entire life. Faced with a force others considered uncontrollable, he first studied the source of its fear, changed the angle, and then climbed onto its back. Later he would try to do the same with rivers, walls, armies, deserts, and empires. The problem was that a horse's fear could be eased by turning it toward the sun. The fears of an army, or of dozens of nations, would not obey the same method forever. At around 16, while Philip was away on campaign, he entrusted part of Macedon's authority to his son. The Mede, a border tribe, seized the opportunity to rebel. Alexander led an army against them, crushed the uprising, and founded a city there bearing his own name. For the first time, the young prince tasted an experience that would later become addictive. When the old order resisted, he could break it with an army. Once the land was controlled, he could stamp it with his name by building a new city. He was not yet a conqueror of the world, but the basic movements of conquest were already there. The Greek world truly took notice of him at the Battle of Coronea in 338 BC. Philip faced the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, and Alexander, about 18 years old, was given an important command. Ancient sources disagree over exactly how he attacked, and later writers often credit him entirely with breaking the sacred band of Thebes, probably an oversimplification. What is certain is that he carried real responsibility in the battle that decided the political future of Greece. After Macedon's victory, Philip created the League of Corinth, compelled most Greek city-states to recognize his leadership, and announced preparations for war against the Persian Empire in Asia. Yet behind the celebrations, Alexander's position suddenly became dangerous. For a prince, the stronger his father became, the more secure the throne appeared. But if that father produced another son with greater support among the Macedonian nobility, Alexander's future could disappear overnight. Before long, that threat became real. Philip married a young Macedonian noblewoman, later known as Cleopatra Eurydice. At the wedding feast, her relative Attalus raised a cup and expressed the hope that the marriage would produce a legitimate heir for Macedon. The words flew like a spear at Olympias and Alexander. implying that their foreign blood made Alexander's claim less than pure. Alexander hurled his cup at Attalus. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his son, but drunkenly stumbled and fell. Alexander mocked him. Here is the man preparing to cross from Europe into Asia, and he cannot even cross from one table to another. The family quarrel was later told with great theatrical flair, but beneath it lay a genuine dynastic crisis. Alexander and his mother left Macedon for a time. Alexander later reconciled with Philip, but Olympias never fully returned to her former position. Then came the so-called Carian marriage affair. Pixodorus, a local ruler in Asia Minor, sought an alliance with the Macedonian royal house through marriage. Fearing that Philip might offer the match to his half-brother, Alexander secretly intervened. When Philip discovered what had happened, he was furious. He believed his son had exposed his insecurity over a marriage unworthy of the royal house, and he exiled several young men close to Alexander. The prince already knew how to command an army, but still could not be sure that he would safely inherit his father's throne. In 336 BC, Philip held a magnificent celebration at Aegae, the old capital, for the marriage of his daughter. At the entrance to the theater, the king wore no armor and kept his guards at a distance, wanting to show the assembled Greeks how deeply he was loved. Then, before the eyes of the crowd, a bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward and stabbed Philip to death. The assassin was caught and killed while fleeing, and so never had the chance to explain publicly whether anyone had directed him. Philip's death remains one of the most mysterious murders in ancient history. Pausanias was said to have been humiliated by the family of Attalus and denied satisfaction when he appealed to the king. Personal revenge may have been motive enough. But did Olympias know? Was Alexander involved? Did Persia encourage the plot? Ancient authors offer hints, but no evidence strong enough to close the case. The simplest and most important fact is this. When Philip fell, Alexander was 20 years old, and he had to move faster than every possible rival. A throne was not a gift that automatically passed to the eldest son. A Macedonian king required the recognition of the army and the nobility. With the support of powerful men, such as Antipater and Parmenion, Alexander secured that recognition quickly, while potential claimants were eliminated. Philip's cousin Amyntas was executed. Threats from another branch of the royal family were suppressed. Attalus, serving with the army in Asia, was killed. Olympias took brutal revenge on Philip's new wife and her child. Alexander may later have disapproved of his mother's methods, but he benefited from the result. The throne rapidly came to have only one unmistakable center. Outside Macedon, however, no one intended to let him inherit his father's supremacy without resistance. News of Philip's death stirred the Thracian and Illyrian tribes. Some Athenians celebrated. Thebes began testing the limits of Macedonian power. Across southern Greece, people said the young king could not hold what his father had won. Alexander marched south at once. Rather than begin with a long campaign of punishment, he used speed to create shock. He seized the routes into Greece, compelled the city-states to renew their recognition of the League of Corinth, and at Corinth received supreme command of the war against Persia. During this southern journey came another famous story. The Cynic philosopher Diogenes lived near a large storage jar and had no interest in wealth or power. Alexander went to visit him and asked whether he could do anything for him. The philosopher replied only, "Yes. Stand a little out of my sunlight." Alexander's attendants mocked the old man's insolence. Alexander, however, is said to have remarked, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Whether the meeting happened exactly as the story claims is less important than what it reveals. Alexander had encountered a strange kind of power. A king could order people to move, but he could not force worship from a man who wanted nothing. Diogenes had no army, yet precisely because he required nothing from the king, he seemed unconquerable. Alexander spent his life seeking a larger world. The philosopher wanted only an unobstructed ray of sunlight. Standing together, they represented two completely opposite forms of freedom. In 335 BC, Alexander did not immediately cross into Asia. First, he marched north to secure his rear. He led the army through the Balkan mountains against Thracian tribes and reached the Danube. His men crossed using local boats and leather skins stuffed with hay, appearing suddenly on the far bank at night and making the enemy believe that Macedonians could pass through any natural barrier. Alexander then turned sharply west and escaped encirclement in the difficult terrain of Illyria. The northern campaigns revealed several qualities that would define him: extreme speed, a willingness to take risks, skill in coordinating different types of troops, and a constant desire to appear personally at the most dangerous point. But because he had gone so far away, a rumor spread through southern Greece that he had been killed. The Thebans revolted, surrounded the Macedonian garrison in their city, and called on the other Greek states to join them. Athens offered encouragement, but hesitated to commit fully. Alexander raced back from the north with astonishing speed. At first, the Thebans refused to believe the army outside their walls was really his. They assumed it belonged to another commander of the same name. By the time they confirmed that the king himself had arrived, their last path of escape was closing. Alexander still offered terms, but both sides shouted demands at one another. Thebes refused to submit, and the fighting quickly ended in the city's capture. We cannot dismiss what followed as merely a young king establishing authority, because the price was paid by real people. Many Thebans were killed. Large numbers of survivors were sold into slavery. The city was systematically destroyed. Only a few temples, families friendly to Macedon, and the former home of the poet Pindar were spared. Alexander had the allied members of the League of Corinth participate in the decision so that the punishment could be presented as a collective Greek judgment. But no one misunderstood who had truly given the order. The destruction of Thebes rang across Greece like an explosion. The other city-states immediately fell silent. Athens sent envoys to seek peace. Alexander did not extend the punishment because he needed Greece stable, and he needed soldiers, ships, and political legitimacy for the expedition into Asia. For him, Thebes was both a warning and a tool purchased with time. One extreme act secured several years of outward obedience behind him, but also cast the first permanent shadow across his rule. When later generations praise his treatment of the Persian royal family, they must also remember that in his early 20s he was capable of ordering the destruction of a once glorious Greek city. From the beginning, the hero and the conqueror were never separate men. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander left Antipater as regent and marched toward the Hellespont. Ancient sources disagree on the numbers, but modern estimates usually place his force at more than 30,000 infantry and about 5,000 cavalry, along with engineers, surveyors, doctors, historians, priests, merchants, and camp followers. Compared with the resources the Persian Empire could mobilize, it was not an overwhelming army. More dangerously, Alexander's finances were weak. He began the campaign in debt and had enough money for only a short period of operations. Some advised him to keep more land and revenue for himself, but he distributed his property among his companions. When a friend asked what he had kept, Alexander supposedly replied, "Hope." The reply may have been polished by later writers, but it captures the gamble at the beginning of the expedition. Alexander did not first acquire an empire and then begin conquering at leisure. He had to keep winning. The grain of the next city had to carry him down the next road. The silver of the next treasury had to finance the next war. One decisive defeat could destroy his army, his reputation, and his throne at the same time. Before crossing, he performed sacrifices on the European shore. In the middle of the strait, he offered another sacrifice to the sea. When he reached Asia, he hurled a spear into the ground, symbolically claiming the continent as land won by the spear. He then visited the ruins of Troy and honored the tomb of Achilles. Alexander and his closest friend, Hephaestion, are said to have paid tribute respectively to Achilles and Patroclus. In that moment, the epic he had read as a boy seemed to become physical geography. He was no longer imagining the dust beneath a hero's feet from a classroom. He was standing on the legendary battlefield itself. But every reader of the Iliad knows that Achilles gained immortal fame at the price of short life. In choosing to imitate him, Alexander seemed to accept the same bargain. The Persians were not unprepared. The satraps of Asia Minor met with Memnon, the Greek mercenary commander, to discuss strategy. Memnon argued that they should avoid a major battle, burn crops and supplies, and use the Persian navy to attack across the Aegean, forcing Alexander to withdraw because of shortages and unrest in Greece. This may have been the more dangerous strategy, but the local satraps were unwilling to destroy their own territories and unwilling to surrender control of the war to a Greek mercenary. They chose to meet Alexander on the banks of the Granicus River. The riverbank favored the defenders. The veteran Macedonian general Parmenion is said to have advised waiting until the next day and choosing a safer crossing. Alexander believed hesitation would weaken morale and give the enemy time to redeploy. He concentrated the companion cavalry on the right and, wearing conspicuous armor, plunged into the current himself. The battle was not the neat collision of two solid walls seen in later paintings. It was a confused struggle in water, mud, on steep banks, amid a forest of weapons. Alexander's spear shattered. A Persian noble nearly struck him from behind, but Clitus cut the attacker down and saved his life. Years later, the man who saved him would die by Alexander's own hand. In that moment, no one could yet see the tragic line connecting the two events. The Battle of the Granicus ended in a Macedonian victory. Persia's defensive line in Asia Minor was torn open, and many satraps were killed. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were treated harshly because Alexander declared them traitors to the common Greek cause. He sent captured armor to the Acropolis in Athens with an inscription presenting it as spoils taken by the Macedonians and their Greek allies from the enemies of Asia. The political message was clear. He wanted an expansion led by a Macedonian king to look like the revenge of all Greece for the Persian invasions of the past. The first great gamble had paid off, but the Granicus was not an ending. It merely showed everyone that this king in his early 20s truly was willing to use himself as the first weapon thrown into danger. That courage would inspire soldiers to follow him. It would also bring the entire expedition, again and again, to the edge of losing its commander. After the Granicus, the western coast of Asia Minor opened like a row of doors. Sardis surrendered without a fight. Ephesus welcomed the Macedonian army. Many Greek cities expelled rulers supported by Persia. Alexander announced the restoration of freedom and local laws, giving his arrival the appearance of liberation. But freedom did not mean the right to reject Macedonian strategic demands. Cities still had to pay tribute, accept garrisons, or obey new arrangements. Local strongmen under the Persian system were simply replaced by institutions better suited to Alexander's interests. He was skilled at preserving useful administrative structures and did not tear everything apart merely because his slogans sounded grand. Miletus possessed a harbor, while the Persian navy still controlled the sea. After taking the city, Alexander made what looked like a daring decision. He disbanded his expensive and inferior fleet, keeping only the ships he needed. Since he could not defeat the Persian navy directly at sea, he would seize its ports from the land and strip it of bases and supplies. It was a way of turning a naval war into a land war, and it showed that he was more than a cavalryman who charged at everything in sight. He asked a different question: what does the enemy's advantage depend on? If the answer was ports, then he did not need to chase every ship. He needed to take away the coast where those ships could anchor. The strongest resistance came at Halicarnassus, where Memnon organized the defense. Walls, trenches, and night attacks made the Macedonians pay for every advance. Alexander's siege engines gradually opened breaches, but the defenders eventually burned part of the city's installations and withdrew into two fortresses. Alexander did not waste unlimited time reducing them. He left troops to continue the siege and moved on with the main army. Victory narratives often hide such choices. He did not always destroy every enemy before leaving. Sometimes he accepted an incomplete victory, handed the remaining problem to others, and seized something more valuable for himself: time. Over the following months, the army crossed Lycia, Pamphylia, and Phrygia. Ancient authors loved to describe Alexander moving along a narrow coastal passage just as the wind and waves withdrew, as though the sea itself had made way for him. The more practical reality is that the march depended on tides, weather, and guides. But when a man wins repeatedly, ordinary good fortune begins to look like divine favor. And when the commander himself is willing to believe that destiny stands beside him, the belief feeds back into greater boldness. In 333 BC, Alexander reached Gordium. The city preserved an ancient wagon whose yoke was fastened by an elaborate knot. Legend said that whoever untied the Gordian knot would rule Asia. In the best-known version, Alexander drew his sword, cut through it, and declared the problem solved. A less dramatic account says he removed the wooden pin holding the yoke, allowing the knot to come loose by itself. Either version captures the way his mind worked. Others assumed the rules required patiently finding the end of the rope. Alexander first asked what the true objective was. If the goal was to separate the yoke from the wagon, cutting the rope or removing the pin was more useful than obeying the ceremonial surface of the riddle. But Asia was not a knot that could be settled with one stroke of a sword. The Persian navy was still active in the Aegean. Memnon might even have carried the war back into Greece. Alexander's rear remained insecure. Then fortune, or accident, helped him again. Memnon died of illness, and the Persian naval offensive lost its most capable organizer. At the same time, King Darius III began assembling a great army in person. Alexander would no longer face provincial governors. He was about to confront the ruler of the vast Persian Empire himself. After the Macedonians entered Cilicia, Alexander suddenly fell ill at Tarsus. Ancient stories blamed a fever brought on by bathing in an icy river, though the cause may have been exhaustion, infection, or some other disease. As the physician Philip prepared medicine, Parmenion sent Alexander a secret warning that the doctor might have been bribed by Darius to poison him. Alexander handed the letter to Philip and, while the doctor read it, drank the medicine in front of him. Philip's expression changed as he read, but the king calmly finished the cup. Alexander recovered, and Philip's innocence was vindicated. Is another story that seems almost designed for its hero. Alexander turned trust into a public gamble. If he refused the medicine, he might die of the illness. If he trusted the doctor, and the doctor really was an assassin, he would die of poison. He chose to let Philip see that he would not flinch. Such gestures can create extraordinary loyalty, because the person being trusted feels compelled to prove worthy of it. But they also reveal Alexander's habit of compressing complicated risks into a single display of personal courage. In youth, that habit often brought victory. A few years later, it would become dangerous. Darius marched north from the broader plains of Syria, while Alexander had moved south, and the two armies somehow passed one another among the mountain routes. Darius entered the area around Issus, cut the Macedonian line of retreat, and dealt with the wounded men Alexander had left behind. When Alexander learned what had happened, he turned north. Suddenly, the terrain reversed the balance of advantage. The Persian army might have used its numbers on a wide plain, but now it was compressed into the narrow strip between mountains and sea. Darius placed his infantry along the river and concentrated cavalry on the coastal side. Alexander again commanded the right wing, preparing to drive directly toward the center where the king stood. Around November of 333 BC, the Battle of Issus began. As the Macedonian phalanx crossed the river, gaps opened in its line, and the center came under severe pressure. Near the coast, Persian cavalry launched heavy attacks against Parmenions' left. Once again, the decision came on the right. Alexander broke through with the companion cavalry and then angled toward Darius's chariot. Men fell around the Persian king. When Darius saw that the position could no longer be held, he turned and fled. In ancient warfare, the departure of a king could instantly break the psychological center of an army. The Persian forces began to collapse, and the narrow terrain magnified the confusion. Alexander pursued for a time, but failed to capture Darius. He did seize the king's chariot, bow, shield, and royal cloak. More importantly, Darius's mother, wife, children, and other members of the royal household fell into Macedonian hands. When they heard that Darius's chariot had been captured, they assumed he was dead, and cries of mourning rose from the royal tent. Alexander sent word that Darius still lived and promised that the family would be treated according to their royal rank. Later generations especially loved one scene. When Alexander and Hephaestion entered the women's tent, Darius's mother mistook the taller and more stately Hephaestion for the king and bowed to him. When she realized her mistake, she apologized in terror. Alexander replied, "You are not mistaken. He too is Alexander." The line may be a carefully arranged piece of literature, but it reflects the intimacy between the two men. Hephaestion was not necessarily Alexander's finest general, but he was the man Alexander trusted most, the Patroclus of his heroic imagination, and one of the few people who retained a genuinely private place beside the king. Alexander's restraint toward the royal captives may have come from his personal code of honor, but it also carried political value. He was no longer satisfied with simply destroying Persia. He was beginning to present himself as a man more worthy than Darius to protect the Persian royal family. If he behaved only as a raider, Persian nobles would fight to the death for the old dynasty. If he appeared as a plausible new ruler, some of them might change sides. Mercy and ambition were not contradictions here. They served one another. Darius made several attempts to negotiate. Ancient sources preserve different versions of the offers, but they broadly included ransom for his family, the surrender of vast territories, a marriage alliance, or a division of power. Parmenion is said to have remarked, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander answered, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The exchange may not be word for word, but the two men truly saw the situation differently. The veteran saw a war that had already produced astonishing gains, with deeper advance bringing only greater danger. The young king saw that as long as Darius still called himself King of Kings, any division meant admitting that another center of power existed on equal terms with his own. Alexander did not want half an empire. He wanted the only supreme authority. Even so, he did not immediately pursue Darius into Mesopotamia. The Persian navy could still use the ports of Phoenicia to threaten the Aegean. Alexander's strategic logic remained unchanged. Seize the eastern Mediterranean coast first, then advance into the heart of the empire. Most Phoenician cities surrendered. Tyre alone, a powerful island city, refused to admit him into its central temple to make a sacrifice. To the Tyrians, allowing a foreign king to enter the sanctuary as master would amount to submission. To Alexander, leaving an independent city with a fleet and a fortified harbor behind him was both a military threat and a public challenge to his prestige. At that time, Tyre stood on an island offshore, with walls dropping directly into the sea. A conventional land army could not reach it. Alexander ordered the ruins of the old mainland city pulled apart and used to build a causeway into the water. The work advanced quickly at first, then became more difficult in deeper water. Tyrian ships constantly harassed the builders. Defenders hurled stones and incendiaries from the walls and sent out fire ships loaded with combustible material, smashing and burning the Macedonian siege towers. Wind, waves, and enemy attacks repeatedly drove months of labor back into the sea. Alexander refused to abandon the siege. He acquired fleets from Phoenician and Cypriot cities that had already submitted, reversing the balance at sea. His engineers widened the causeway. Ships carried siege engines and attacked the walls from several directions. The siege lasted about 7 months, until the Macedonians opened a breach and their fleet forced its way into the harbors. The punishment after the city fell was severe. Large numbers of inhabitants were killed and many others sold into slavery. Ancient figures may be exaggerated, but the scale of the catastrophe is beyond doubt. The siege of Tyre is often praised as a miracle of engineering and determination. It must also be remembered as an urban tragedy. Alexander proved that he could make the land reach into the sea. He also proved that anyone who publicly refused him might pay an extreme price. The causeway later altered currents and sediment, gradually joining the island to the mainland. More than 2,000 years later, the geographical trace of the conquest can still be seen on a map. Few wars have shown so clearly that one man's order can even change a coastline. After Tyre, the army continued south along the coast. Gaza refused to surrender. Its fortress stood on high ground, while the surrounding sand made it difficult to bring siege engines close. Macedonian engineers built an enormous mound and hauled the heavy machinery up to a usable height. Alexander was wounded in the shoulder during the siege, but continued directing the attack. When the city fell, defenders and civilians met a brutal fate. Ancient accounts of the humiliating punishment supposedly inflicted on the commander Battus are highly dramatic and clearly echo the Iliad, so the details cannot be confirmed. What is certain is that as Alexander moved closer to Egypt, a clear pattern had formed in the way he treated victory. Those who submitted early could often keep their positions. Those who resisted for too long might be turned into examples designed to inspire fear. This was not simply a matter of temper. It was a cold language of rule. Alexander wanted the next city, before opening its gates, to imagine what had happened to the last one. But every time that language worked, the king became more convinced that he had the right to decide who deserved protection and who should be made an example. The efficiency of conquest was slowly changing the conqueror. At the end of 332 BC, Alexander entered Egypt. Unlike Tyre and Gaza, the country offered little large-scale resistance on behalf of the Persian dynasty. Egypt had rebelled against Persian rule more than once, and to many local elites and priests, exchanging one distant ruler for another did not necessarily seem worse than continued government by a Persian satrap. Alexander did not present himself as a foreign occupier. At Memphis, he sacrificed to Egyptian gods, accepted the style of pharaonic kingship, preserved local religious and administrative traditions, and placed key military power in Macedonian hands. The experience mattered deeply. In the Greek world, a king still had to face noble companions and the traditions of the city-states. He could not simply rise above everyone like a god. In Egypt, sacred kingship was already part of the political order. For the first time, Alexander entered fully into an ancient system that connected monarchy with divinity. When he later demanded greater forms of reverence, it is too simple to say that he had suddenly gone mad. Egypt showed him that a ruler of a multi-ethnic empire did not have to depend only on Macedonian approval. He could also gain legitimacy through rituals familiar to the different civilizations he ruled. Following the western branch of the Nile to the Mediterranean, Alexander noticed the bay between the island of Pharos and the mainland. It lay close to the Nile without sitting directly in the most heavily silted river mouths. It could connect the Egyptian interior with Mediterranean trade. Alexander ordered a new city planned there and named it Alexandria. Stories about marking the city walls with barley flour, only for birds to descend and eat it, an omen supposedly meaning the city would feed people from every land, have the flavor of legend. What is more certain is that the location was exceptional. Alexandria later became one of the Mediterranean world's greatest ports, centers of learning, and royal capitals. Alexander himself saw only lines drawn on the ground, but he left behind something that endured longer than many of his battlefields. Then he did something that tangled history and myth even more tightly. He crossed the western desert to consult the oracle of Ammonius at the oasis of Siwa. The journey was difficult. Ancient writers describe ravens or snakes guiding the travelers when they were lost, and sudden rain falling in the sandstorm, as if divine signs had been prepared for the hero. We have no reliable record of what Alexander asked the priests, nor can we know whether a linguistic misunderstanding turned a greeting, such as "my son," into a phrase suggesting "son of Zeus." Alexander clearly left believing he had received an important confirmation, but he rarely explained publicly what the oracle had said. That ambiguity was precisely what gave the episode its power. A clear answer could be debated. An answer known only in the king's mind could change with his needs. To Greeks, he could say that Ammonius and Zeus were equivalent. To Egyptians, he was a pharaoh recognized by the god. To himself, he may increasingly have believed that the old stories of thunder and divine blood were more than his mother's boasting. When a man repeatedly crosses barriers everyone else calls impossible, it becomes easy for him to see luck, talent, and divine favor as the same thing. In 331 BC, Alexander left Egypt and marched northeast again. By then, Darius III had assembled a new army in the heart of the empire. He chose an open plain near Gaugamela and had the ground cleared in advance so that his cavalry and chariots could maneuver freely. The Persian forces came from many regions of the empire. Ancient figures for their size are wildly exaggerated, and modern scholarship cannot provide a single certain total, but the army was clearly larger than Alexander's. Darius also deployed scythe chariots and war elephants, hoping to use numbers and mobility to their fullest on the plain. On the night before the battle, Parmenion is said to have suggested a night attack. Alexander refused, declaring that he would not steal a victory. The words have heroic force, but practical reasons mattered as well. Sending a mixed army into a vast and unfamiliar enemy camp in darkness could easily create chaos. A daylight battle, though more direct, better suited Alexander's well-practiced command system. Tradition says Darius feared a night assault and kept his men awake under arms, while Alexander slept so deeply that his generals had to wake him. The contrast may be the literature of the victors, but it creates a clear image. One king unable to rest beneath the weight of his enormous army and the fear of losing his kingdom, the other treating fate as a wager he had already accepted. When the battle began, Alexander did not charge straight ahead. He led his right wing diagonally to the right, drawing Persian cavalry after him and stretching their line. Darius feared the Macedonians would move off the ground he had prepared and sent troops to stop them. As the cavalry forces became entangled, a gap opened between the Persian center and left. Alexander immediately formed the companion cavalry into a wedge and, together with the royal infantry guards, drove toward Darius's position. At the same time, the scythe chariots raced toward the Macedonian line. Light troops attacked the drivers with missiles. Some infantry units deliberately opened lanes, then surrounded the chariots from the sides and rear after they passed through. The vehicles failed to tear apart the phalanx, as Darius had hoped. On the other side of the field, Parmenion came under tremendous pressure, and even the Macedonian camp was threatened for a time. Alexander had an opportunity to continue pursuing Darius, but turned back when word arrived that the left wing was in danger. Gaugamela was not an effortless performance of genius. It was a dangerous battle in which several local crises might have changed the outcome. Darius fled once more. The Persian army lost its center, and the line collapsed. The Achaemenid Empire did not vanish from the map immediately after Gaugamela, but as a unified military power capable of contesting supreme kingship with Alexander, it had suffered a mortal blow. The army acclaimed Alexander king of Asia. From that moment, he no longer entered Persian territory merely as a Greek avenger. He began openly taking possession of Persian kingship itself. Babylon opened its gates. The satrap Messiah surrendered and was allowed to retain an important office, sending a signal to other Persian elites. Cooperation with the new king did not necessarily mean the destruction of the old administrative class. Alexander performed sacrifices, restored damaged temples, and showed respect to Babylonian priests. The city's broad roads, immense walls, palaces, irrigation works, and ancient scholarly traditions dwarfed Pella, the Macedonian capital. Alexander had conquered more than territory. He had conquered a world with centuries of experience in imperial government. To rule it, he would have to learn from it. Next, the treasury at Susa fell into his hands. Its vast reserves of gold and silver completely reversed the expedition's financial position. The young king, who had begun with hope as his only capital, now possessed enough wealth to pay armies, mint coins, build cities, and reward commanders. Wealth solved many problems, but created new ones. The shared hardships of the early campaign gradually gave way to the distance of a royal court. Soldiers saw more Persian attendants, ceremonies, and luxury surrounding their king. Alexander discovered that he was no longer merely first among companions. He had become the center of a monarchy stretching across continents. To reach the Persian heartland from Susa, the army had to cross the Zagros Mountains. Part of the force took an easier route, while Alexander led elite troops toward the Persian gates. The local commander, Ariobarzanes, used the narrow valley to stage an ambush. Boulders and missiles rained down from above, and the Macedonian frontal attack failed. Alexander withdrew, found local guides, and followed a rough path around the position, striking the defenders from behind. The battle is sometimes called the Persian Thermopylae because a small force made a final stand for its homeland in difficult terrain. In the Greek story of revenge, Alexander was the victor who broke through the Persian gates. In Persian memory, Ariobarzanes was the hero defending his country. History never looks at a road, only from the direction of the advancing army. Early in 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis. This was no ordinary city. It was a ceremonial center of the Achaemenid dynasty, built to display the order of the empire. Reliefs along the palace stairways showed delegations from many lands bearing tribute, each with distinct clothing and hairstyles, yet arranged within a single harmonious and majestic vision of kingship. To stand, there was to step inside an imperial declaration carved in stone by generations of Darius's ancestors. The wealth of the treasury was staggering and required enormous numbers of animals and carts to move. The Macedonian army also looted the city. Several months later, the palace complex burned. Ancient sources disagree sharply over the cause. One story says that during a banquet, an Athenian woman named Thais proposed burning the palace in revenge for the Persian destruction of the Acropolis generations earlier. Alexander, carried away by wine and cheering, supposedly led the procession with a torch and regretted it when sober. Another explanation holds that the fire was a calculated political act meant to symbolize the end of the old dynasty. Both may contain part of the truth. The language of revenge supplied the meaning, while the emotion of the banquet pushed the decision into action. Whatever the motive, the image of flames consuming the palace is powerfully symbolic. Alexander claimed to be the successor to the Persian throne, yet burned the grandest stage of Persian kingship. He wanted to prove the old order was finished, but he needed the officials and institutions of that order to rule. Fire could proclaim victory. It could not administer taxes, roads, or a multinational aristocracy. His later adoption of more Persian customs may show that Alexander eventually realized he had not burned an empty shell at Persepolis. He had burned the royal robe he was about to need. In Greek tradition, the fire was often described as the completion of revenge for wars more than a century earlier. In Iranian cultural memory, however, Alexander was not naturally a great liberator. He could be a cursed destroyer who burned sacred places and broke a dynastic tradition. The same man who appeared in Western legend as a second Achilles could become the name of disaster in another land. This was not a minor difference of opinion. It was the double truth left by conquest itself. The victors seize the road opening ahead. The conquered see their home in flames. Alexander did not remain among the ruins. His most important enemy was still alive. As long as Darius III survived, the eastern satraps could rally in the name of the old king. The campaign changed from the seizure of cities into a long pursuit across the Iranian plateau. At the end of that pursuit, Alexander would discover that defeating a king and replacing a king were two entirely different things. Darius III fled to Ecbatana and then continued east, hoping to rebuild his forces in Bactria and the northeastern provinces of the empire. Alexander pursued relentlessly, often driving his men to the limits of endurance. Mountain roads, drought, and exhaustion wore the army down, but he understood that this was a political race. If he captured Darius first, he could openly assume the kingship. If Darius reached lands still loyal to him, the war might become a long campaign of attrition all over again. The nobles around Darius began to lose confidence. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, and several others seized control of the king and carried him eastward. Perhaps they intended to force him to abdicate. Perhaps they simply wanted to use him to buy time. In the summer of 330 BC, as Alexander's advanced troops drew near, the conspirators stabbed Darius, abandoned him in a wagon, and fled east. When the Macedonians arrived, they found the Persian king dying or already dead. Later tradition says that a Macedonian soldier gave Darius water, and that the king used his final words to thank Alexander for treating his family well. Another story has Alexander removing his own cloak and laying it over the body. Such details cannot be verified. What is certain is that Alexander buried Darius with royal honors and presented his death as the murder of a king by his own subjects. The gesture was politically crucial. Darius was no longer an enemy to be humiliated. He became the previous legitimate monarch, while Alexander appeared as the rightful successor who would punish the regicides. Bessus then proclaimed himself king of Asia under the royal name Artaxerxes. That allowed Alexander to claim that he was no longer pursuing a Persian ruler as a Macedonian invader. He was a lawful new king punishing a traitor. The political language of the campaign had completely reversed. It had begun under the banners of Greek freedom and revenge against Persia. Now Alexander demanded that Persians recognize him as heir to the Achaemenid monarchy, and that Macedonians accept him not only as the king they knew, but as the great king of an Eastern tradition. The transformation first became visible in his appearance in court. Alexander gradually adopted elements of Persian dress, brought Persian nobles into his inner circle, and retained or appointed local satraps. He did not copy the Persian system in full, nor did he abandon the Macedonian army. He was trying to combine two forms of rule. To his new subjects, this suggested respect for their traditions. To Macedonian nobles who had followed him for years, it looked as though their king was becoming the very thing they had marched out to defeat. In Macedonian political culture, the king drank, hunted, and fought beside his nobles. They could speak bluntly to him and even quarrel with him. Royal authority was powerful, but it still wore the appearance of companionship. The Persian court placed greater emphasis on distance, rank, and ceremony. When Alexander dressed in Eastern styles and surrounded himself with foreign attendants, the older officers saw more than a change in taste. They faced a crisis of identity. Were they the men who had helped Macedon conquer Asia, or merely an old guard about to be absorbed into an Asian court? Tension soon became entangled with conspiracy. Late in 330 BC, a guards officer named Dimnus became involved in a plot to assassinate Alexander. The plan was supposedly reported to Philip, commander of the companion cavalry, but he failed to pass the warning on promptly. Philip was the son of Parmenion, a man of illustrious family whose arrogance and sharp tongue had already made enemies. Whether he truly took part in the assassination plot is unclear. After interrogation and an assembly of the army, he was executed. An even colder decision followed. Parmenion was far away at Ecbatana, commanding large numbers of troops and controlling treasure and supply lines. He was given no chance to defend himself. Alexander secretly dispatched messengers with orders to kill him before he could learn of his son's death. The military logic is easy to understand. A veteran commander with an army whose son had just been executed might become a mortal threat. But the political consequence was just as clear. Parmenion had served Philip and helped Alexander survive the most dangerous early stages of the expedition. Now the king was no longer willing to risk allowing him to live long enough to answer the charge. The episode marked a dividing line. Before it, Alexander had been a young commander completing the war alongside the veterans of his father's generation. Afterward, he increasingly depended on a younger group of officers whose loyalty belonged directly to him. In the early years, danger had usually come on the battlefield. Now it also came from banquets, letters, and silence. The larger the empire became, the harder it was for the king to distinguish genuine conspiracy from political disagreement or private resentment. The boundaries of security kept expanding, and anyone who might someday become a threat could be removed in advance. The army continued east through Arya, Drangiana, and Arachosia, then crossed the Hindu Kush. The geography became harsher and less familiar. The uplands were cold, the passes starved men of breath, the rivers were broad, and settlements lay far apart. Alexander repeatedly founded or refounded communities under his own name, using garrisons, roads, and administrative points to hold the results of conquest in place. Not every Alexandria was a magnificent new city rising from empty ground. Some were older settlements renamed. Others were military colonies or frontier posts. But together they formed a line of nails pinning the route of the expedition to the map. Bessus withdrew beyond the Oxus River and burned the boats, hoping to stop the pursuit. Alexander had his soldiers stuff animal skins with dry grass to make floats and cross the river. Seeing that his position was hopeless, Bessus's allies arrested him and handed him over. Alexander tried him as a regicide, subjected him to severe punishment in the Persian manner, and eventually had him executed. On the surface, Darius had been avenged. In reality, the northeastern empire did not become peaceful. Sogdiana and Bactria were not blank spaces waiting for a king's seal. Local nobles possessed mountain fortresses, cavalry, and intricate networks of loyalty. They could move quickly between river valleys, open country, and towns. Spitamines emerged as the center of resistance. He avoided the set-piece battles Alexander handled best. Instead, he attacked garrisons, cut communications, and vanished into the terrain. Alexander could capture a city in a single day. He could not guarantee that the city would still obey him the day after he left. Near Maracanda, a Macedonian force pursued Spitamines and was ambushed and virtually destroyed, one of the expedition's rare major reverses. Alexander rushed to the area, but the enemy had already disappeared. He then launched widespread reprisals. Villages and resistant strongholds were destroyed, and local people paid a terrible price. Ancient numbers may be exaggerated, but the brutality of the campaign is not in doubt. The war in Central Asia proved that genius in decisive battles could not automatically solve guerrilla resistance. When an enemy refuses to fight in your preferred way, conquest becomes a long cycle of pursuit and revenge. Alexander reached the Jaxartes and founded his farthest Alexandria on the northeastern edge of the empire. He then crossed the river to strike nomadic peoples on the opposite bank. The city's name was itself a declaration. This was the edge of the world, and the farthest point reached by the king's will. But a frontier does not stop moving simply because it has been named. Beyond the river lay the steppe. Beyond the steppe lived peoples known only through rumor. The closer Alexander came to the end of the world, the larger the world seemed to become. Those 2 years changed the army. The soldiers were no longer moving between the rich lands of Asia Minor and the royal capitals of Persia. They were being consumed by cold, dust, and repeated revolt. The early war could be explained as the liberation of Greeks, revenge against Persia, and the seizure of royal treasuries. Now, they were chasing unfamiliar tribes and crossing one apparently endless river after another. Alexander interpreted every difficulty as a reason to continue. If a region might still rebel, then his rear was not safe. If an enemy remained ahead, then victory was not complete. That logic had no natural endpoint. Conquering one territory created a new frontier. The new frontier created new threats. The new threats demanded another conquest. The empire was like a lamp growing brighter and larger. As the circle of light expanded, so did the darkness around its edge. Alexander was no longer pursuing only the kingdom of Persia. He was chasing a boundary of security that retreated forever before him. Under prolonged pressure, his temper also became more explosive. The rapid decision-making that had been invaluable on a battlefield could become intolerance of contradiction inside a court. Faith in personal courage could turn into contempt for anyone who questioned him. Belief that destiny had chosen him could make other people seem like tools placed along destiny's road. The most painful eruption came at a banquet meant to celebrate victory. The dead man was Clitus, the officer who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. Around 328 BC, Alexander and his commanders were drinking at a banquet in Maracanda. Macedonian feasts had always allowed boasting, argument, and mockery, and wine brought hidden grievances to the surface. Someone performed a song ridiculing Macedonian officers who had recently suffered defeat. Clitus considered it an insult to the veterans. He began praising the achievements of Philip's reign and reminded the room that Alexander's victories belonged not only to the king, but to the Macedonians who had bled for them. Alexander did not hear an old soldier's complaint. He heard a denial of his greatness. The quarrel escalated quickly. Clitus reminded him that he had saved his life at the Granicus and mocked the king for crediting a divine father and Persian flatterers with achievements won by Macedonian blood. Others dragged Clitus out of the room, but he returned through another entrance and continued provoking Alexander with lines of poetry. Alexander reached for his sword, but attendants had hidden it. He shouted for the guards, seized a spear, and finally drove it into Clitus. In an instant, the banquet fell silent. The man who had blocked a killing blow at the river lay dead in front of him. Alexander's rage collapsed into horror. He pulled out the spear and even tried to kill himself, but those around him stopped him. For several days, he shut himself away, refused food, and repeatedly called Clitus by name. Philosophers and priests tried to console him. Some blamed Dionysus or fate. Others argued that kings should not be bound by ordinary morality. But the simplest truth could not be erased. Clitus had spoken cruel words, and Alexander had killed the man who saved his life with his own hand. This episode revealed more clearly than any battlefield defeat how conquest had changed him. At the Granicus, Alexander had needed Clitus. In the court at Maracanda, Alexander could no longer tolerate being reminded that he had ever needed anyone. His remorse was real, but remorse could not bring the dead back to life, and it did not stop the same fear of threatened power from continuing to grow. Soon afterward, Alexander tried to introduce at court a formal gesture of bowing before the monarch. Persians performed such gestures according to rank and custom, and did not necessarily understand them as worship of a god. Greeks and Macedonians, however, usually reserved full prostration for the divine. To them, offering such reverence to a man meant the king was demanding honors beyond tradition. Alexander may have wanted a single court ceremony that could include both Persians and Macedonians. He may also have wanted the ritual to confirm that he stood above every noble. Whatever his motives, once a ceremony entered a cross-cultural court, its meaning no longer belonged to the king alone. At a carefully arranged banquet, some guests accepted the ritual, but the historian Callisthenes refused. A relative of Aristotle, he had accompanied the expedition as its chronicler and had once used magnificent language to present Alexander as a hero. Now he publicly argued that honors for gods and honors for men must remain distinct. Alexander did not force him on that occasion, but his displeasure was obvious. Callisthenes, blunt and arrogant in his own right, had offended many others as well and gradually lost the protection he once enjoyed. Later, a group of young royal pages plotted to assassinate Alexander. The conspiracy was uncovered. There is no reliable evidence that Callisthenes took part, but he was close to some of the youths and had already become the symbolic center of the dispute over court ritual. He was arrested and died either in confinement or by execution. Ancient authors disagree. Whatever the exact manner of his death, the historian who had helped write the king's myth was finally consumed by the king's power. Words can raise a conqueror onto a divine pedestal, but they cannot keep the writer safe in its shadow. Meanwhile, resistance in Central Asia was gradually broken. Spitamenes was killed by his own allies, and his head was sent to Alexander. Some local nobles chose cooperation. The king had learned that destruction alone could not sustain long-term rule, and he began absorbing local elites through appointments and marriage. The most famous episode took place at the so-called Sogdian Rock. The fortress stood on steep mountain ground. Its defenders boasted that the Macedonians could never reach them unless they grew wings. Alexander called for expert climbers from the army and offered a large reward. Several hundred men climbed through the night using iron pegs, ropes, and cracks in the rock. Some fell to their deaths. The survivors reached the heights and waved strips of cloth. Alexander then sent a messenger to tell the defenders that the winged men had arrived. When the garrison saw Macedonians above them, they assumed a large force had reached their rear and surrendered. The operation displayed Alexander at his most captivating. He could turn an enemy's boast into an assignment, transform the impossible into a recruitment order, and use the courage of a few men to create a psychological effect far greater than their actual numbers. But the story of the rock had a second part. Among the families of the local nobility was a young woman named Roxana. Alexander married her. Ancient writers say he fell in love with her at first sight. Others emphasize the political meaning of the marriage. Both can be true. Roxana came from a Bactrian or Sogdian noble family, and the marriage helped connect the king with the elite of the Northeast. Alexander did not treat her merely as a captive prize, as many victors might have done. He held a formal wedding, sending a signal of respect to local society. To Macedonian nobles, however, the king's marriage to an Asian woman was another unsettling change. Any future heir might carry both Macedonian and Eastern blood. That was precisely the new order Alexander hoped to build, and precisely the order many of his old companions found hardest to accept. By 327 BC, the northeastern frontier appeared to be under control. Alexander could have stopped, reorganized the empire, and returned to Babylon or Macedon. Instead, he turned his attention toward India beyond the Hindu Kush. What ancient Greeks called India was not the same as the complete modern nation. It referred more broadly to the Indus Basin and the vast, little-known lands beyond it. Herodotus and other writers had described the region's riches, strange animals, and unfamiliar peoples, mixing fact with rumor. The Persian Empire had once ruled parts of the Indus region, so Alexander could present his eastward advance as the restoration of former Achaemenid territory. But his curiosity, hunger for glory, and fascination with the edge of the world mattered just as much. He may have believed that beyond India lay the outer ocean encircling the world. The map in his mind was not a modern map. It was a space made of known rivers, rumored peoples, and mythical boundaries. Each new river might be mistaken for the upper course of some famous stream. Each mountain crossed might reveal the world's edge. Conquest and inquiry were always entangled in Alexander. He wanted to know what lay ahead, and he wanted whatever lay ahead to know who he was. The army crossed the Hindu Kush again and entered what is now eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. The valleys were narrow and crowded with fortresses. The local peoples were not united. Some surrendered, others resisted. Alexander divided his forces and personally led elite troops through difficult mountain warfare. The Macedonians faced arrows, rolling stones, and sudden attacks. As always, the king moved close to the walls himself. The habit inspired morale, but it also meant that any minor skirmish could become the disaster that left the empire without its center. A massive rock stronghold called Aornos was believed never to have been captured. Legend even claimed that Heracles had failed there. To Alexander, such a story was not a warning. It was an invitation. If a place was famous only because no one could take it, then it automatically became a stage on which he could prove himself greater than a mythical hero. Macedonian engineers piled earth and stone into a platform across part of a deep ravine, gradually pushing the siege works closer to the heights. When the defenders attempted to withdraw, they were pursued, and the rock was finally taken. Every achievement no predecessor had managed made Alexander more certain that his road carried a special meaning. The soldiers, however, did not experience abstract immortality. They felt worn sandals, rusting armor, wounds reopening, and home receding farther into the distance. They had crossed into Asia in 334 BC and had not returned to Macedon for years. Many had expected the war to end when Persia was defeated. The Persian king had long been dead, yet the army was still marching toward the rising sun. The ruler of Taxila chose cooperation. He supplied Alexander with provisions, elephants, and guides, and hoped to use Macedonian power against his neighboring rival, King Porus. Local politics did not pause simply because a foreign conqueror had arrived. Every side tried to use the new force to alter an old balance. Alexander never advanced through a land whose people had no choices at all. His success repeatedly depended on local rulers willing to surrender, ally with him, or borrow his army for their own revenge. The roads of empire were paved by cooperation as well as war. Across the Jalem River, the Hydasps of the ancient Greeks, Porus had gathered his army. Monsoon rains had swollen the river, and elephants stood across the muddy plain like a line of moving walls. Alexander was about to face a force the Macedonians had never truly experienced. He would win one of his most famous and difficult victories. But after that victory, what awaited him was not a wider chorus of celebration. It was the first collective refusal from his own army. The Hydasps separated the two forces. Porus stationed war elephants along the bank and watched the crossing points day and night. The river was broad, and rain made the current violent. Any frontal crossing risked being driven back into the water by cavalry and elephants before the Macedonians could establish themselves on shore. Alexander did not rush the attack. He began a patient deception. Again and again, he moved troops noisily along the river and pretended to prepare a crossing. At first, Porus shifted forces to meet every movement. Over time, he began to treat the commotion as harassment. Alexander also left a commander in the main camp who resembled him in appearance and equipment. Campfires continued to burn and orders continued to be shouted, convincing the opposite bank that the king remained in place. The real assault force moved secretly upstream during a thunderstorm, using wooded islands and vegetation as cover while searching for a crossing point. The crossing was less clean than the plan suggested. At one point, the troops discovered that another channel still lay ahead, and men and horses struggled through deep water. But wind and rain covered the noise, and the main force eventually reached the far bank. Porus sent his son to block them, but Alexander defeated him. Porus then formed his elephants, infantry, chariots, and cavalry into a full battle line. The war elephants placed the Macedonians under unprecedented pressure. Their size, noise, and smell terrified the horses. Warriors on their backs hurled weapons from above. When the animals drove into infantry, they shattered orderly formations. But elephants were not tireless machines. Macedonian light troops attacked the drivers and the animals themselves. Cavalry occupied Porus's mounted forces on both wings, while the phalanx endured amid the chaos. As time passed, wounded and frightened elephants began turning inside the crowded battlefield, trampling men on their own side. The battle became a contest of endurance, discipline, and pain. Porus, a tall man commanding from the back of an elephant, continued fighting until he was wounded and his army collapsed. Alexander admired his courage and sent someone to ask for his surrender. Tradition says Alexander asked, "How would you like to be treated?" Porus answered, "Like a king." When Alexander asked whether he had any further request, Porus replied, "Everything is contained in that one answer." The exchange may also have been polished by later writers, but it captures the kind of enemy Alexander admired. He hated men who refused to recognize his authority, yet respected those who preserved the bearing of a king even in defeat. Porus not only regained his own territory, but received additional lands, becoming an important client ruler for the Macedonian Empire in the region. Alexander needed him because a foreign army could not personally govern every village in town. Porus needed Alexander because the alliance strengthened his position against neighboring rulers. What looked like generosity contained both heroic respect and clear-eyed imperial calculation. To commemorate the victory, Alexander founded a city called Nicaea and another named after Bucephalus. The horse he had tamed as a boy died around this time. Ancient sources disagree over whether it died of battle wounds or old age. What is certain is that Bucephalus had accompanied Alexander through almost the entire journey from Macedonian prince to king of Asia. For a man who habitually turned people and territories into pieces of strategy, his attachment to the horse feels unusually private. Bucephalus never argued about court ritual, never coveted the throne, and never reminded him of what power was doing to him. It simply carried him into battle and carried him out again. After the victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander continued east. The monsoon did not end. The land was hot and wet, and one river followed another. Local people told the soldiers that still greater kingdoms lay ahead, capable of fielding more infantry, cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. The ancient figures were probably exaggerated, but the psychological effect on an exhausted army was real. The question was no longer whether they could win the next battle. It was how many next battles the world still contained. They reached the Hyphasis, today's Bios River. Alexander prepared to continue east, but the army refused to move. At first, the refusal took the form of silence. Then the general Cenas spoke for the men. He did not deny Alexander's greatness, nor did he call the soldiers cowards. He pointed out that many were dead. The survivors were covered in scars. Horses and equipment were worn down, and the men missed their parents, wives, and children. A commander, he argued, should know when victory was enough. New generations could volunteer for new risks. The same men could not be ordered to march forever. This may have been the hardest opponent Alexander ever faced. Darius could flee. Walls could be broken. Rivers could be crossed. A fortress could be scaled by men with wings. But the exhaustion of an entire army had no central point that cavalry could smash. Alexander gathered the officers and delivered an impassioned speech. He reminded them of the wealth and glory they had won together. The outer ocean, he insisted, might be only a short distance ahead. He used the method that had worked countless times before, presenting the unknown as one final door. No one answered. Alexander withdrew to his tent and refused to see anyone for several days. Perhaps he expected the weather or the gods to change their minds. Perhaps he hoped silence would produce shame. The soldiers did not yield. Finally, he performed sacrifices, and the omens were announced as unfavorable to crossing the river. In that way, the retreat did not have to be described as the king surrendering to his army. It could be presented as obedience to divine will. Alexander built enormous altars beside the river to proclaim to the future that his army had reached this point. Then he ordered the march to turn back. On a map, the Hyphasis is merely the easternmost point of the expedition. In Alexander's mind, it was a boundary he truly could not cross. For the first time, he had been stopped not by an enemy, but by his own men. He had not lost a battle, but he had been overruled in a contest of wills. Perhaps for that reason, the return would not be a quiet journey along the old road. Alexander chose to march south along the Indus, explore a route to the outer sea, and transform retreat into a new expedition. The army returned to the Hydaspes and began building a fleet. Trees were cut, and ships took shape along the banks. Nearchus and others commanded the naval force, while the army marched in columns along both sides of the river. Alexander held elaborate sacrifices, and the fleet moved downstream. To the soldiers, the river was finally flowing in the direction of home. To Alexander, it was still an unknown world. He intended to chart tributaries, subdue settlements, establish outposts, and discover whether the Indus truly reached the ocean surrounding the earth. Communities along the river responded in different ways. Some surrendered, some abandoned their towns, others resisted. Alexander was eager to crush the Malians and personally led rapid assaults. During the siege of one city, there were too few ladders and too many soldiers crowded onto them. The ladders broke. Alexander had already reached the top of the wall and was stranded with only a few men. A rational commander would have waited for the army to force open the gate. But for Alexander, standing exposed on the wall under enemy fire was easier to accept than climbing back down. He jumped into the city. Enemies closed in from every direction. Alexander fought with his back against a wall as the companions beside him were wounded one by one. An arrow pierced his armor and drove deep into his chest. When he collapsed, Macedonian soldiers thought their king was dead and smashed through the gates in a frenzy. The doctors had to enlarge the wound to remove the arrowhead. Alexander had lost a great deal of blood and struggled to breathe. When word reached other units, men wept in the camps, and some feared the entire expedition might disintegrate in an unfamiliar river valley. Days later, rumors still claimed the king was dead. Alexander ordered that he be carried onto a boat. As it approached the camp, he raised a hand to the soldiers. The army first fell silent, then erupted into shouts, tears, and celebration. He insisted on mounting a horse so that everyone could see with their own eyes that he was alive. His generals rebuked him for risking himself like an ordinary soldier. He may have answered that precisely because he was king, he had to prove his courage at the point of greatest danger. But the incident exposed the central contradiction of heroic command. Alexander's willingness to charge personally was one reason the army followed him. It was also the reason a single nameless arrow could, at any moment, collapse a political order spread across hundreds of thousands of square miles. He had tied personal courage to the security of the state. The greater he became, the less he could afford to fall like an ordinary man. But the body understands nothing about empire. It only bleeds. After recovering, Alexander continued down the Indus to the Delta. He personally sailed toward the Gulf and observed the tides. Soldiers from the Mediterranean were unfamiliar with such dramatic periodic changes in sea level, and the fleet was briefly thrown into confusion. Alexander sacrificed to the sea gods and cast ceremonial vessels into the water, as if he had finally touched the edge of the world. But geography did not end there. The sea continued west, and unfamiliar deserts lined the coast. Nearchus would lead the fleet in search of a route to the Persian Gulf. Alexander made a far more costly decision. He would take part of the main army through the Gadrosian Desert. Ancient and modern explanations differ over why he chose the route. Perhaps he wanted to support the fleet, control the coast, and open a line of communication. Perhaps he was drawn by stories that Semiramis and Cyrus had both suffered failure there and wanted to prove that he could do what they could not. Whatever the motive, this time the desert would not yield like the Gordian knot to a single stroke. The Gadrosian Desert lies across what is now southeastern Iran and southwestern Pakistan. The army entered during a season of extreme heat. The route passed through waterless sand, stony wasteland, and barren valleys. Pack animals died constantly. Food supplies failed. Guides lost the way. Heat shimmered distorted vision by day, while nights turned cold. Soldiers left the column in search of water and vanished among the dunes. Sudden floods also swept away people, animals, and equipment. The desert's greatest cruelty was not a visible enemy. It was the way each step slowly weakened judgment, discipline, and hope. Ancient writers preserve one famous scene. A few soldiers found a small amount of water at a distance and carried it to Alexander in a helmet. Everyone watched. If the king drank, the others would remain thirsty. If the water were divided, no one would receive enough to matter. Alexander took the helmet and poured the water onto the ground in front of the army. The soldiers were said to have drawn strength from the gesture, as though every one of them had drunk it. The story may have been shaped into heroic form, but it fits the way Alexander sustained morale. He understood that symbols could sometimes matter more than material resources. Pouring out the water could not relieve anyone's thirst, but told the men that the king would not claim a private chance of survival. Yet shared suffering cannot erase one fact. Alexander had chosen the route. A commander enduring disaster beside his soldiers does not make the disaster justified. When later generations praise him for refusing the water, they must also ask why the whole army was led into a desert that nearly swallowed it. By the end of the crossing, the losses were severe. Exact numbers are impossible to recover, But large numbers of animals, camp followers, and soldiers died, while equipment and plunder were abandoned. Unlike Gaugamela, this was not a defeat inflicted by an enemy, but it may have been one of the most expensive decisions of the entire campaign. Alexander finally reached Carmania and joined Craterus, who had returned by a safer route. He later reunited with Nearchus, whose fleet had successfully sailed along the coast from the mouth of the Indus to the Persian Gulf, gathering important geographical knowledge for communication between the Eastern and Western Empire. Alexander celebrated the naval achievement and tried to cover the catastrophe of the desert with the atmosphere of victory. Back in the imperial heartland, Alexander discovered a different kind of problem. During the long Eastern campaign, some satraps had abused their power, raised troops without permission, seized property, or assumed the king would never return alive. Alexander began investigating and punishing officials. Some cases rested on clear charges. Others may have become part of a political purge. Harpalus, who controlled the royal finances, feared punishment and fled to Greece with a huge sum of money, creating a new diplomatic crisis. The conqueror had finally learned that while his eyes were fixed on India, the empire behind him did not remain loyal automatically. He also went to Pasargadae to inspect the tomb of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. The tomb had reportedly been looted and its grave goods damaged. Alexander ordered it restored and punished those held responsible. The gesture was rich in symbolism. Years earlier, he had stood before the tomb of Achilles as a young man following a Greek hero. Now, standing before the tomb of Cyrus, he looked more like a ruler seeking to inherit the traditions of the Persian Empire. His model had expanded from the warrior of epic to the king of the world. In 324 BC, Alexander reached Susa and staged a mass wedding on an unprecedented scale. He himself married Statura, the daughter of Darius III, as well as a woman from the family of Artaxerxes III. Hephaestion married another daughter of Darius. Other senior commanders married Persian noblewomen, and the marriages of thousands of Macedonian soldiers to Asian women were formally registered and rewarded by the crown. The celebrations lasted for days. Clothing, music, and ceremony all tried to bring two elite traditions into a single space. The weddings are often presented as proof of Alexander's dream of uniting East and West. There is some truth in that interpretation, but should not be romanticized. Marriage was first of all a political instrument. It was meant to connect Macedonian conquerors with the Persian royal house and local nobility, giving the future ruling class a shared interest in the empire. Many of the marriages were not entirely voluntary. After Alexander's death, several Macedonian commanders quickly abandoned their Asian wives, revealing how fragile the unity created by the ceremony truly was. Yet Alexander's plan was not empty theater. He had begun training large numbers of Asian youths in Macedonian weapons and formations. They were called the successors. He incorporated Persian cavalry, promoted Asian nobles, and admitted them into the system of royal companions. From the perspective of imperial rule, the policy made sense. Macedon had a limited population and could not forever control a vast Asian empire with a small pool of European soldiers. To the veterans, however, it looked as though the king was training their replacements. The conflict erupted at Opis. Alexander announced that the older, wounded, and unfit Macedonian soldiers would be sent home with rewards. On the surface, it was a generous provision for veterans. But the soldiers heard another message. Now that the king had a new Persian army, he intended to discard the men who had conquered the world beside him. They protested openly and demanded that all Macedonians be discharged. Let Alexander continue the war with his father a mocking reference to the god Ammonius, and with his Asian troops. The insult struck Alexander at his most sensitive point. He identified several ringleaders in the crowd and ordered the guards to arrest and execute them. Then he delivered a long speech. He recalled how Philip had transformed Macedon from a poor frontier into a great power. He emphasized how he himself had led the men to the wealth of Asia, turning ordinary soldiers into governors and rich men. He listed his wounds and declared that no part of his body had escaped injury in the common cause. If they believed he had treated them unjustly, he said, then they should all leave. They could return home and tell everyone that they had abandoned their king alone among the peoples he had conquered. After the speech, Alexander withdrew into the palace and refused to receive the Macedonians. Instead, he appointed Persians to positions in the army and court and held ceremonies according to a new hierarchy. The veterans quickly realized this was not merely a royal tantrum. Alexander genuinely could rebuild a structure of power around Asian elites without them. A few days later, Macedonian soldiers gathered outside the palace gates, laid down their weapons, and begged forgiveness in tears. Alexander emerged and reconciled with them. He called the Macedonians his kinsmen and held a banquet attended by thousands, seating Macedonians and Persians together according to rank and offering prayers for harmony in the empire. About 10,000 veterans eventually returned home under Craterus with gifts. Alexander also paid their debts and continued their wages until they reached Macedon. The episode at Opus is often told as a moving reconciliation between king and soldiers. In reality, it was closer to a confrontation over power. The soldiers proved they could still act collectively and force the king to respond. The king proved that he was building an empire no longer completely dependent on Macedonians. The two sides wept and embraced, but the central conflict remained unresolved. Alexander wanted to become the common ruler of all his subjects. The Macedonians believed the empire was a prize they had purchased with their blood and that they should always occupy its highest place. This was the deepest problem in Alexander's political experiment. If he admitted new subjects on more equal terms, the old conquerors felt their privileges slipping away. If he preserved the privileges of the old conquerors, the enormous empire could not develop a stable sense of shared loyalty. Alexander tried to hold both sides together through personal prestige and to create a new community through marriages, armies, and ceremonies. But that community had no mature institutions and no widely accepted rules of succession. It depended too heavily on one man, standing in the center and assuring every group that he still understood them. Even as Alexander tried to stitch the empire together, his orders shook the Greek world. He issued the exiles decree, requiring the Greek city-states to readmit political exiles and restore their property. To the exiles, it was salvation. To the cities forced to surrender land and political rights, it was direct royal interference in their internal order. The League of Corinth had preserved the appearance of local autonomy. Now, the king of Asia was reaching through that appearance. Athens and other cities feared conflict, while Antipater's position in Macedon also came under suspicion because of his long struggle with Olympias. Alexander also moved closer to accepting divine honors. Some Greek cities may have proposed them voluntarily in order to flatter him, while members of the court encouraged the idea. Ancient societies did not always draw an absolute modern line between gods and human beings. Hero cults, the deification of cities, and the sacralization of kingship all had precedence. Even so, many Macedonians considered the honors Alexander appeared to demand excessive. The ambiguous seed planted at Siwa had grown into a practical political problem. Did Alexander consider himself the son of a god, a king especially favored by the gods, or a man who should be worshipped like a god? We cannot enter his mind. We can only see that he became increasingly willing to let those answers overlap. At the moment when the empire seemed to have reached its height, Alexander's most important private support suddenly disappeared. In the autumn of 324 BC, Hephaestion died of illness at Ecbatana. The man Alexander called another self, who had walked with him from the tombs at Troy into the depths of Asia, did not follow him onto the next road. Hephaestion's death shattered Alexander. Ancient writers describe him cutting his hair, ordering the manes of horses to be cut, suspending music and celebrations, and even having part of the city wall demolished, as though the whole city had to display mourning. He punished the doctor who had failed to save Hephaestion, consulted oracles about what heroic honors should be granted, and planned an astonishingly expensive funeral and memorial. Many details may be exaggerated, but the depth of his grief is beyond doubt. The loss was more than the death of a general. Hephaestion had long coordinated court affairs, diplomacy, and logistics. He was the man who connected Alexander's private trust with the daily business of empire. He may not have been the most brilliant figure in every battle, but he understood plans that increasingly exceeded Macedonian tradition. At the Susa weddings, he had married a daughter of Darius, meaning that his future children might have been closely connected to Alexander's own dynasty. If the empire was to develop a new core combining Macedonian and Persian elites, Hephaestion would likely have stood second only to the king. Now that place was empty. Alexander turned grief into enormous ritual and into military action. During the winter, he campaigned against the Caucasus. Ancient writers called the expedition a sacrifice offered to Hephaestion. Whether or not that judgment is fair, it shows that Alexander's most familiar response to pain was still action, conquest, and the organization of a project larger than an individual life. He could order tens of thousands of men to build a funeral monument. He could not order death to retreat. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander marched toward Babylon. Along the road, ominous stories multiplied. Seers warned him not to enter the city. Animals died in unusual ways. Someone mistakenly sat on the royal throne. A gust of wind carried away his crown. Ancient authors, knowing the ending, loved to arrange such events into a prophecy of fate. The reality may be that Mesopotamian priests, reading celestial signs, believed the king faced danger, and Alexander did show concern about omens. But he could not permanently avoid the most important city in his empire because of a warning. Babylon now resembled the world capital of his imagination. It stood at the center of imperial communications, linking the Mediterranean, the Iranian plateau, the Persian Gulf, and the roads east. It possessed mature traditions of administration, astronomy, and hydraulic engineering. Envoys from many regions came to honor him, some reportedly from distant peoples. Alexander inspected fleets, repaired canals, and prepared an expedition against the Arabian Peninsula. Nearchus had already proved that a sea route from India to the Persian Gulf was possible. The next step might be to control the Gulf, explore the Arabian coast, and open new military and commercial routes. He also planned a larger reorganization of the army, integrating Macedonian phalangites more closely with Persian archers, javelin troops, and other units. Ships, soldiers, craftsmen, and supplies gathered around Babylon. Ancient accounts of Alexander's last plans, including possible campaigns into North Africa, Carthage, or Italy, are highly disputed and may contain exaggeration or later political invention. What can be said with confidence is that he was not preparing to retire. For Alexander, an empire was not complete when a king sat on a throne and declared it finished. It was complete only when the next fleet entered the water and the next army marched out. In late May or early June, he attended a series of banquets and sacrifices. Ancient accounts say that after drinking at the house of his friend Medius, he was suddenly struck by pain or fever. His condition worsened day by day. Records written in the style of a royal diary describe him continuing to bathe, perform sacrifices, and issue sailing instructions to officers, even as he gradually lost the ability to walk and had to be carried from room to room. The fever continued. His voice grew weaker. The cause of Alexander's death remains unknown. Rumors of poisoning appeared almost immediately, with suspicion falling on the family of Antipater, on Aristotle, and on various enemies at court. But many poison stories were written down later and carry the shape of political propaganda. His illness also lasted more than 10 days, which does not fit neatly with the common poisons available in the ancient world. Modern theories have included malaria, typhoid, other infections, diseases of the pancreas or liver and gallbladder, as well as the cumulative effects of old wounds, heavy drinking, and physical exhaustion. Without a body or reliable clinical records, every diagnosis remains speculation. The most honest answer is that Alexander died in Babylon after a prolonged fever and physical collapse, and we do not know what disease killed him. As his condition worsened, rumors spread through the army. The soldiers feared that the generals were hiding news of the king's death and demanded to see him. At last the palace doors opened, and the Macedonians filed past his bed. Alexander could no longer speak. He could only respond with his eyes or a slight movement. One by one came the men who had crossed the Granicus with him, fought through the Persian gates, climbed the Hindu Kush, battled in the Indian rain, and survived the desert. At the Hyphasis, they had once refused to let their king cross another boundary. Now none of them could prevent him from approaching this one. He is said to have handed his signet ring to Perdiccas. Ancient sources disagree over whom he named his heir. Some say he answered, "To the strongest." Others say he could no longer speak. Still others imply that he hoped his unborn child would inherit. To the strongest fits the dramatic outcome of the later wars of the successors so perfectly that it may have been invented afterward. The colder fact is that whatever Alexander said, he left no adult successor with a claim clear enough and power strong enough to compel obedience from everyone. In June 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon, about a month before his 33rd birthday. He had ruled Macedon for 13 years and campaigned in Asia for more than a decade. Death came so suddenly that the immense machinery of war was still in motion. Ships were ready. Sacrifices had been arranged. Envoys were waiting. Orders had just been written. It was as though a rider at full speed had suddenly vanished from the saddle, while everyone behind him remained leaning forward, unsure whose hands now held the reins. Roxana was pregnant. Alexander also had an adult half-brother, Aridaeus, who was not considered capable of ruling independently. The generals argued over the succession in Babylon. The cavalry and senior commanders favored waiting for Roxana's child to be born. An infantry faction supported Aridaeus. The dispute nearly became a civil war inside the palace. In the end, a compromise was reached. Aridaeus became king as Philip III, and if Roxana gave birth to a boy, the child would also be king. The child was born and became Alexander IV. Both kings were figureheads. Real power belonged to regents and regional commanders. The arrangement was unstable from the beginning. An adult king unable to govern, an infant, and a collection of generals who commanded armies, ruled wealthy provinces, and distrusted one another could not remain united merely through a shared memory of the dead. During his life, Alexander had concentrated authority intensely in himself. He had not created a system capable of resolving disputes normally without him. On the battlefield, he had always ridden personally to the critical breach. Death created a breach no cavalry could fill. His body became a symbol of power as well. The generals designed an elaborate funeral carriage, and the original plan may have been to return him to the royal tombs of Macedon. Ptolemy, however, took control of the procession and diverted the body to Egypt, where it was eventually buried in Alexandria. Possession of the conqueror's remains conferred a measure of legitimacy. While Alexander lived, he moved armies in order to control cities. After his death, his generals moved his body in order to control memory. The following decades were consumed by the wars of the successors. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and others formed alliances, betrayed one another, and fought repeatedly. None could fully inherit Alexander's position. Each possessed armies and territory, but none possessed his personal authority across the whole military world. The empire gradually broke apart into Hellenistic kingdoms. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt. The Seleucids controlled great areas of Asia. The Antigonid dynasty eventually established itself in Macedon. Alexander's mother, wife, son, half-brother, and other members of the royal family were also killed one after another in the struggle for power. The dynasty that had claimed to unite peoples could not protect its own inner family. So when we return to the deathbed in Babylon, to the strongest no longer sounds like a magnificent final command. It sounds more like a curse. The generals did use war to prove who was strongest, but no one gained the complete empire. When Alexander defeated Darius, the Persian Empire at least possessed an administrative tradition that could be taken over. At his own death, Alexander left an unfinished hybrid order designed around himself. Others could divide the land, the treasuries, the armies, and even his body. They could not divide the personal center that had temporarily held everything together. Yet the empire's division did not mean that everything Alexander created disappeared. Quite the opposite. His death is usually treated as the beginning of the Hellenistic age. Hellenistic does not mean that Greek culture simply covered the East in one direction, nor that a harmonious new world suddenly appeared. It describes a long transformation produced by war, migration, trade, dynastic competition, and cultural exchange. Greek became an important language of communication across many cities and courts. Macedonian and Greek settlers moved into Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and other regions. Local traditions, in turn, reshaped the religions, art, and royal institutions of the new kingdoms. Ancient traditions credit Alexander with founding or renaming anywhere from more than a dozen to several dozen cities. Not every place called Alexandria can confidently be attributed to him personally. But he did establish many military, administrative, and commercial points along the route of the expedition. Some began as garrison settlements and later became real cities. Others gradually faded. Alexandria in Egypt was the most important. The Ptolemaic dynasty transformed it into a Mediterranean metropolis. Its royal quarter, harbors, lighthouse, library, and scholarly institutions made it a center of knowledge and trade. That greatness cannot simply be counted as Alexander's personal achievement, but it began with his judgment about one stretch of coast. In Central Asia and northwestern India, Hellenistic kingdoms remained in contact with local cultures for generations. Artists would later use Hellenistic forms to depict Buddhist figures. Coins carried different scripts and gods. Rulers searched for legitimacy across multiple political traditions. These developments were not a blueprint Alexander had designed in advance, nor a gift of civilization instantly delivered by one campaign. They were the history created by countless merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, monks, officials, and local inhabitants after conquest forced large-scale contact. Giving all the credit to Alexander would once again allow one enormous individual to hide everyone else's life. His military influence was more direct. Later commanders studied how he combined phalanx and cavalry, used speed to disrupt an enemy's preparations, crossed rivers, mountain passes, and deserts, and seized the fleeting gaps in an enemy line at Issus and Gaugamela. Roman generals and emperors idolized him. Pompey imitated his image. Caesar was said to have felt anxious when comparing his own age with Alexander's achievements. Conquerors in later centuries repeatedly used him as their standard. Whenever someone wished to prove that he was not merely a king, but a man capable of changing the shape of the world, Alexander's shadow was summoned. But his reputation for invincibility must be understood carefully. He did avoid decisive defeat in his major set-piece battles. Yet he also suffered mountain ambushes, the destruction of detachments, failed siege assaults, a desert catastrophe, and the refusal of his own army to obey. Undefeated is a summary of battle outcomes. It does not mean that every decision was correct or that the cost can be ignored. Nor did his advantage come from individual genius alone. Philip II had left him a mature reformed army, experienced commanders, the League of Corinth, and a campaign in Asia already set in motion. Parmenion, Craterus, Cenas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Nearchus, and countless unnamed engineers, scouts, interpreters, and soldiers all made the expedition possible. Without the pikes and organization Philip had built, Alexander's courage might have amounted only to a series of dangerous impulses. Likewise, Persia's defeat cannot be reduced to a tired East inevitably losing to a youthful West. The Achaemenid Empire still possessed immense resources and sophisticated institutions, but its size slowed mobilization. Regional satraps had different interests. Early strategic decisions were poor. The naval plans suffered after Memnon's death. Darius fled from two critical battlefields, badly damaging morale. Alexander's extraordinary speed repeatedly forced his opponents to respond at unfavorable moments. The outcome came from the interaction of institutions, command, terrain, accident, and individual decisions, not from the natural superiority of one civilization over another. Alexander's moral record is also impossible to finish with a single word. He could respect Porus, protect Darius's family, restore the tomb of Cyrus, and accept surrendered nobles. He could also destroy Thebes, punish Tyre and Gaza with extreme severity, crush resistance in Central Asia, kill Parmenion without a public defense, and stab Clitus in a drunken rage. He possessed genuine curiosity and a willingness to learn from unfamiliar systems. He also possessed an insatiable hunger for glory and wagered tens of thousands of lives on his image of the world. His attempt to bring Asians into the imperial center went beyond the imagination of many Macedonian companions. But the integration was still imposed from above by the conqueror and did not remove inequalities of power. In Greek and many Western traditions, he became the Great. In some branches of Persian religious and national memory, he became a destroyer or even an accursed figure. In later Persian literature, he could be absorbed again under the name Iskandar into stories of kingship and the pursuit of knowledge. In legends across the Middle East, Europe, and South Asia, he searches for the water of life, flies into the sky, descends beneath the sea, and encounters strange peoples. The historical Alexander lived only 32 years. The legendary Alexander has lived again and again. Every age uses him to ask its own questions. What is greatness? Can conquest create order? Can knowledge and power travel together? And after a man reaches the end of the world, what could he still want? Perhaps the most striking fact is that he never truly returned to Macedon. He became king at 20 and crossed into Asia at roughly 22. After that, he continued moving east, south, or toward new centers of power. He conquered the Persia his father had dreamed of, but never returned to Pella to display the completed achievement to his homeland. He became pharaoh in Egypt, organized fleets in Babylon, staged weddings in Susa, and married Roxana in Central Asia. He gradually became a man who could no longer be defined simply as king of Macedon. Yet his soldiers still longed for Macedon. His old nobles still judged him by Macedonian customs. His dynastic claim still came from that northern kingdom. The closer he came to being ruler of the world, the farther he moved from the place where he had begun. His body also carried the cost of relentless expansion. He suffered repeated wounds to the head, shoulder, leg, and chest. Years of marching, feasting, illness, and changing climates accumulated. Alexander often acted as though willpower could command the body just as it commanded armies and cities. The arrow in the Malian town, the heat of Gidroja, and the fever in Babylon finally reminded everyone that the body is not an administrative province of an empire. It does not keep functioning simply because the king gives an order. Now we can return to the mystery posed at the beginning. Did Alexander conquer the world? He conquered a vast part of the world he knew, but nowhere near the entire planet. When he reached northwestern India, powerful kingdoms still ruled the Ganges basin. China was in the Warring States period. Rome was still expanding in the western Mediterranean. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, and many more distant regions lay completely outside his mental map. World Conqueror describes the astonishment of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern observers. It is not a statement of modern geography. Did he create a stable empire uniting East and West? He made bold attempts, but did not live long enough for the institutions to mature. Marriages, mixed armies, local appointments, and shared rituals show that he understood occupation alone was not enough. The mutiny at Opus, the conflicts at court, and the fragmentation after his death show that one man's will could not replace a durable political structure. Did he deserve to be called the Great? The answer depends on what we mean by great. If it refers to military scale, speed of action, historical impact, and imagination, then his greatness is beyond dispute. If great automatically means merciful, just, and right, the title hides destroyed cities, displaced people, and the nameless dead. A mature encounter with history does not simply drag him down from the pedestal and condemn him, nor does it become hypnotized by the numbers of his victories. It sees his ability, ambition, creation, and harm at the same time. Perhaps his most astonishing achievement was not how far he traveled, but that people have continued arguing over who he was for more than 2,000 years. An ordinary victor is buried beneath the next war. Alexander turned himself into a measure of ambition. Whenever a young person believes time is too short, the world too large, and the impossible must be done at once, Alexander's story begins to glow again. Whenever a ruler places a private dream above the exhaustion of everyone else, his story sounds its warning again. Beside the bed in Babylon, the soldiers filed past. What they saw was a young man who could no longer speak, yet still tried to answer with his eyes. He was not forever raising his head like a statue from myth. He was not forever charging like the figure in a battle mosaic. He was simply a human life nearing its end, surrounded by unfinished plans. He had defeated the current of the Granicus, the narrow ground at Issus, the plain of Gaugamela, the sea walls of Tyre, the snows of the Hindu Kush, and the rains of the Industry. He had even forced the desert, for a time, to release its survivors. But in the end, he did not defeat time. He did not defeat succession. He did not defeat the limits of the human body. And that is why his story has more power than a heroic legend made of unbroken victories. What Alexander truly left the world was not an imperial map that would never change. It was a question with no easy answer. When a person possesses enough courage, intelligence, and power to keep pushing every boundary outward, what should make him stop? At the Hyphasis, exhausted soldiers stopped him. At Babylon, death stopped him. In history, he never truly stopped at all. Even today, we continue walking the roads he left behind, moving back and forth between glory and cost, trying to decide whether the young man who rode Bucephalus and threw his spear onto the shore of Asia was chasing the edge of the world, or chasing a self that could never be satisfied. And that is where the story of Alexander the Great comes to an end. I'm Jason from the Eastern Historian. Good night, sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time.